pawn. Now the bishops will get traded off. And this is one of Wesley's quality as well. He could be taken very well by shock, by surprise with knight a2, but he just composes himself so quickly and finds the best way forward.
He's quite an objective player. You don't really see Wesley take unnecessary risks. So if he can trade off all the pieces and secure a position where he doesn't have big losing chances, he will go for that. And right now he has grabbed that knight on a2. Like David said, the queen takes it and plays b4. So it's kind of like hanging pawns, but there are three of them. But he is gaining access to the d4 square. If black pushes the pawn up to c4 right now, the knight will slide into this juicy d4 square. That bishop on b7, it's a passive piece. Black does have this well-established, protected passed pawn on c4. That's the good news. But that bishop is not great. There are going to be some long-term chances for both sides. It's a very double-edged position.
Yeah, really strong move there from Wesley So, and it's not a pawn sacrifice, we should mention. Pawn takes pawn. It looks like the white queen is in a bit of trouble here. The pawn in front of her is pinned, but simply a slide to the right, a check, and next move, you regain the pawn. And actually, this is a far inferior version for Magnus Carlsen here. For example, if he moves his king, suddenly pawn takes pawn, the white knight gets access, but you don't have that strong pawn, that passed pawn that Robert was mentioning. So I think Magnus has to pretty much install it now on the c4 square, has to part with that dark square control, but yeah, very much kind of dynamically balanced right now.
And this is a critical moment. We often talk about critical moments in chess, which are based on calculation long lines, but even trades, structural changes, these are moments that define the rest of the game. So Magnus has slowed down. He needs to take a decision. Does he go forward with the pawn? Does he keep the tension? The line that you were pointing out with that c-pawn moving forward, it not only gives Magnus in compensation for that d4 juicy outpost, the passed pawn, as you mentioned, but also this a3 pawn. That's going to be a long-term weakness in Wesley's camp. Double up the rooks at the edge of the board, the A line, and you've got to tie down all of Wesley's sources defending that. But Magnus takes a thing. c4, are there any other ideas that he's considering right now apart from the c-pawn moving forward?
Well, Magnus is down on time for the first time all game, so that's bad news if you're a Magnus Carlsen fan. Wesley maybe caught him by surprise. It was a clever try with this knight a2, getting your own knight trapped, but this d4 square looking so available to the white knight. I agree with David completely that you should push this pawn to c4. You want to close more lanes. If you take on b4, you're saddled with two separate isolated pawns. That's unideal. But Magnus down under 2.5 minutes right now. He could get in danger because he may not have the time to calculate afterwards.
And he reaches out and he's making a move. Did he take on b4? Yeah, that did look like a capture. We see that happen. Queen gives a check, a trade offered. Anytime Magnus Carlsen offers a queen trade, you've got to slow down and make up your mind. It's always a difficult decision.
Wow, this is really anti-positional, what Magnus is doing. It's not what he wants to be doing, but he's trying to clarify the matter. As Tanya says, if it comes down to an endgame, he's banking on the fact that the black knight in the center is so active, black's rooks will be relatively active. Deficiencies in his pawn structure, yes, black's bishop is a really poor piece in these ensuing endgames, but he's posing questions to Wesley. Does Wesley keep the queens on? He can avoid the queen trade, go recapture the b4 pawn with his own queen. But big decision ahead right now for Wesley. Endgame or no endgame. Tension, no tension.
And if the queens do stay on the board, that means that white will be left with this bad a3 pawn. Tanya had highlighted that before. It's a target for black's pieces. So this was a smart play by Magnus. If he wants to shut down Wesley So's winning chances, queens off the board would have done the trick. But Wesley said, let's keep this game going. Now your pawn on b5 is right in front of the white queen. Can that be grabbed? Whew! d4. So Magnus is still throwing shots at Wesley So.
That's a big shot. You said endgame or no endgame. Usually when you're playing Magnus, the default answer should be no endgame. Wesley keeps the tension going. Magnus sacrificing to open up that bishop on b7, making it a sniper. Magnus looks away. Are there tactics in this position?
I think Magnus, in his mind, he's blundered. He's just thrown away a pawn for pretty much nothing. He's banking, I think he was at least relying on tension, some threats against the f2 square. White's pawn there on f2 near the white king is a bit vulnerable. The black queen, x-ray vision, the black knight attacking it, but there's no tricks, there's no traps. He's simply given away a pawn, and watch out, your b5 pawn is hanging as well. The evaluation bar says he's fine, but Magnus, frustrated at himself, he, after regaining composure there, drops his knight back to d6. Wesley's a pawn up. Wesley has some big chances in this game.
And maybe he was looking at some kind of knight takes pawn on g3 because the bishop on b7 stares at the knight on f3. That knight is currently under attack. but tactically, that would not have worked out, that sacrifice, because f takes g3, and the f5 would have been open. Perhaps we can show that later. But knight d6, that is still a good move. You see the evaluation bar, which the players don't have, saying it's maybe marginally better for white. And the reason why is that the extra pawn is now this isolated d pawn. So black had it, now it's white's turn. And so white's pawns are a bit vulnerable. The black rook can step up to a4 to put pressure on the queen and that central pawn. magNus is still doing okay.
He's doing okay, but he doesn't have the eval bar telling him that. And we saw him react right after giving up his pawn. Right now, magNus is on the defense, down a pawn. He is playing for activity of the pieces, the rook hitting the queen, expecting the light squared bishops to be traded off. And just looking at the two rooks eyeing the d4 pawn, that black knight nicely placed, controlling the b5 pawn. I think magNus has enough to keep things under control in this one.
He should have enough, but it is certainly Magnus Carlsen as black on the defensive who needs to show accuracy to draw this game. I don't think right now Magnus has any winning kind of ambitions in his mind. He just wants to save this one because he is down a pawn. Yes, he might win it back. Yes, black's rook is active. Black's knight is actually perfectly placed, as you mentioned, but some work to be done. Bishop's off the board now, and how will black continue the pressure? Will the rooks align? Will black go for those two weak white pawns? Isolated pawn on the A file and on the D file should be enough to hold, but it's going to get hairy as both players approach the 1 minute mark, and he jumps in with his knight. Magnus really trying to force the issue. He's just trying to hoover, as I would say, everything off the board, vacuum everything off the board. Second pawn drops, though.
Oh, but look at this. That black rook is in the sights of the white queen. But if you take that rook, the knight jumps out of the way into e3 with check to scoop up that queen. So that was really nice tactical awareness from Magnus Carlsen. He's just trying to liquidate at this stage. He's not really playing for a win, but the white king doesn't have too many pieces in front of it. So Wesley, who has been the driver's seat these last few moves, he does still need to exercise some caution.
Really nice trick there. Poisoned rook right now. Wesley cannot take that rook. He drops back with his knight, though, trying to break the coordination between the black rooks. They're kind of protecting each other. I've said it before, X-ray vision. But one of them is hit now. That white knight attacking the rook in the center. This is where things could fall apart. If Magnus isn't careful, he's now down under 1 minute. Then his position could collapse instantly. But he's got to be careful now. He drops a rook back to hit the white queen. Really accurate move there to hold things together.
And it was a very critical one because there was no way to maintain connection of that other rook on the 4th rank to indirectly defend the a4 rook. So rook a5 hits the queen, not giving Wesley time to capture the rook on d4. But it feels like so many pieces are codependent right now, defending each other. And Magnus still needs to be careful because that queen can stay connected to that black knight on the board, creating threats.
Wesley needs to be careful because he's down to 20 seconds. This is not an easy position to figure out. I think if Wesley's given the opportunity, he'll try to trade those queens. Knight d2, hitting the queen on b3, forcing a knight trade here. And I think if all these pieces come off, Wesley with an a3 pawn, he still has maybe an outside shot to win the game. But Magnus, you know him. He knows endgames like the back of his hand. He'll be able to hold that.
And you can do that right now, right? You trade everything off on f3, give a check on d3, and I was going to say you win the a3 pawn. And then I just realized there's another rook on e1 that can step up on the 3rd rank at the end of all the trades. And actually, Wesley survives with the a3 pawn.
Wesley will be a pawn up. It's not the best pawn in the world, the white a3 pawn. Probably more of a weakness than a strength right now. But as you mentioned there, Tanya, if you don't win it, if the queens come off, rooks come off, suddenly that pawn could be priceless. So Wesley recaptures the knight right now. It's still level material. How does Magnus try to compensate for the pawn? The longer you're just a pawn down in this endgame, the more afraid you become. So will he keep the queens on? Magnus loves his endgames, but he can block this trade of queens by swinging black's rook over. No, he goes for the pure endgame. And, okay, it's only Wesley who can win now. It's a 2-result game. Magnus needs to show great defense to hold this game.
I love that move, though. By pushing his pawn, he wanted to push it one step further, and he's trying to kick the king back and also gain some key squares for his rook. So Wesley's king, that's going to be stuck over there on g2 or on that side of the board. And then how do you push your pawn? You'll need to line up both of the white rooks to the square, but after rook e3 is forced. And now without these rooks on the board, white's pawn structure, it's fractured, which makes it harder and harder to win.
Yeah, if the white king was slightly quicker, if the